Hello, in this video, I'm going to explain the concept of async await in a simple and easy way to understand. By the end of this video, you should be comfortable using async await in JavaScript. Let's get started. Welcome back. In this tutorial, I'm going to explain the async await keywords in JavaScript and how they relate to the promise. If you watched my other video on promise in JavaScript, you should use this video as a continuation of that video. If you've not watched it, check the link in the description and I recommend you watch that video first. In this video, we're going to look at a number of things. First is the async keyword. Then the second will be how it returns a promise. Then we will look at await. Then we look at error handling in async await. Then we will look for a practical example. Like in the previous example, I guess in the promise we used an API, we'll do the same here. So ideally, async await, this should be async. Async await is a way of making it easier for you to work with promises. As you're going to see in this example, you can use these keywords with promises to make it way easier for you to work with promises. So this is a 4 or 5 point video that's going to explain each and every one of these concepts that relates to this particular topic. I'll begin by its declaration. If you have a function, example here, just a normal JavaScript function that returns a string, hello, this should be returned, that returns, this is just a normal function. We can turn this to a synchronous function by simply adding the keyword async. So once we add that keyword async in front of the function keyword, we make this an asynchronous function. Then we can have this return a promise, then we resolve. We can do this, another example. Then we can return promise dot resolve. Then we do hello. So I'd like to first of all call the first function. I call the first function, which is example. And as you can see, immediately we declare the function as an async function, it returns a promise. This is the example one. This is the same as this particular function, this second function here, where we are creating a promise with a resolve of hello. So this is example. So if we changed this to, you can see we are returning a promise. We are having a promise in this async function. So it's the same as this function. You see, this function also returns a promise. So this is the way to declare an asynchronous function. So that's the first step. The second step is it returns a promise. As you can see, that function returns a promise. So now I want us to look at the next part, which is the await. A practical way to use async await, we can use the example used in the promises. We create a function here, fetch data. Then we turn this function to asynchronous by adding the keyword async. So this is a synchronous function which should return a promise. Then we can do here const, the response will be equal to, and we now await, then call in the fetch method. This fetch method will pass the URL we would like to fetch data from. We're going to pass the URL there. Then in here, we're going to get the data back, which will be equal to, we add the await keyword, then data, response, the particular data, then we change it to JSON. We convert it to JSON.json. Then we return the data. So this is a synchronous function to fetch data from an API. That's how we would do it. This needs to have error handling. We are on this point, so we have dealt with await. Now we look at how to handle errors, then we move into a practical example. So how do you handle error in this function here? We use the try catch. I've done another video on try catch, and I also explained the concept in the promises. We can introduce here a try catch. We can use the traditional try catch. You can do try, then if, then we move this data, this block here, then do catch, then we pass the error as the parameter. Then in here, we can log the error. You can just say fetch async, fetch error, then we pass the error. So that's what we need to close that. That's how you handle errors in the async await. This is the fourth point. Finally, let's move to now a practical example of using async await to fetch data from an API. Now we look at a practical example of using async await. So we begin by creating a function. This function will fetch data from an API, just like we did in the promises. Then this function needs to be asynchronous. So we turn it to be asynchronous by adding the keyword async. So this is an asynchronous function that's going to return a promise. In here, the first step, we need to use the try to get hold of the errors. Then we can end up this try here with a catch. Then we pass in the error message. Then in here, we're going to log the error to the console. This should be error, so that we log the error in the console. Then you can pass in the error message. Then want to make it more visible, need to close that. So we have already dealt with error handling. Then inside here now, we begin our fetch data. So in here, we fetch the data, then return a promise. We do const response will be equal to await. Then this await, we give it the URL, API URL. Then we need to define this URL inside this function. In here, we do a const API URL should be equal to, then we grab the URL from JSON folder. We get the URL for our free data. So we get hold of this get. Once we get hold of that, we place it here. That's where we are going to get our data from. Then this await needs to have the fetch method. So what we're simply doing here, I'd like to enlarge this, close that, back to the console. We are doing a try catch to hold the errors, to get hold of the errors. Then we are returning a promise here. I emphasize that. Then in here, we've done a response. Then we need to add an extra layer to control if there is an error in making the response. So if the response of the server is not okay, response is not okay. So what we do, we throw an error. So we do a throw new error, and that error needs to just be a simple message, fetch failed. So that will give us like a guardrails to protect us from the bad server response. Now, suppose everything goes well, we now pass the data, and you do const.data, then this should be equal to await again, then you do response dot, then you convert this to JSON. That's how we've done it. We have put a guard clause here to protect us from server errors, like if the response is not okay, it's just going to give us an error. So at that point, we can tell like there's a problem. Then the second part is we now have passed the data. This should be data. Then we have now the data, and we are now ready to display the data. Down here, we can do display the data. To display the data, we need to create a constant. We call it data display, which will be equal to, I added this to save us time, so we want to display these. We're going to get this element document dot, let me move to a new line to make it more visible, document dot get element by ID. So we grab that element from the screen, this particular element, which has the ID display data, this which is empty. So that's what we need to add data to. That's our constant. So far, so good, no errors. Then now we need to attach the data. We need to attach this data. How do you attach? We just attach it. Data display dot. We can use, instead of, can use text content, which will be equal to. Then we can now use the backticks to give us the better way of handling this data. In here, we can now look at the data first. In this data, we need to first of all return this data so that we visualize, we understand what data is returned here. Before we do this, we need to console log the data here. This data, let's see what's in this data, or if there are any errors we're going to find. Then for us to see these, we need to call this function so that we can find out if everything is working. So we are going to call that function. We don't need to console log it again. We have the data here. I'd like to enlarge this. We have an object. We are pulling in the data from that API, this JSON placeholder API. And this data has a user ID, an ID, a title, and the body. So we are sure our promise is turning the data as we expected. Let me enlarge this. So back here, we need to now continue to display that data. And to display this data, I used the template retrievals. I did a tutorial on template retrievals, this backtick syntax. If you've come across them and don't understand what they are used to easily display data and interpolate or add variables into your data output. So back to this. So here we can do a title, then we just do output the data. So this will be data.title. You can see it here, this title. The next is the body. So we can wrap this into a H3 tag. We can wrap that into a H3 tag. So that's our title. Then we can do a P, which will represent the body. Then we do body, which will be similar to this. So I simply need to copy that, then change this data.body. We have got our data and we've added it to this particular div. But now we have an extra div here, which can be good for us to attach this function so that that function will work on it based on an event listener. Back here, we need to grab this button. We can simply do document outside the function now, dot get element by ID. Then once we have that, we can now fetch the ID. We can put the ID there of that particular button. Then this button, we need we can equate it. We can simply equate it to an event listener. So we can do something like a different way of doing it. We can equate this to a variable. We can call it like const fetch data button will be equal to document.get element by ID. Then we now need to listen to the click event of this button. And once that button is clicked, we call this method. Down here, we do something like fetch data button. That's what we need to get hold of. Then we add an event listener, and this event will pass the second parameter to be this name of this function. We are sure that the second parameter will be the name of that function. We are going to end up there. Then this event is a click event. Once the button is clicked, we are going to listen to that event of click. Then we are going to run this function. This function will grab data from this URL. Then we wrap it in error handling. Then here we are console logging the data for just debugging. So I hope this looks like something that is going to run and it's not going to cause any issues. So I would like to just save it first. And we have a problem here. And I guess this problem has something to do with the way we are calling the method. Everything else seems okay. We can troubleshoot this problem by simply looking at the message. Uncaught type error, so that's a type error. The problem has something to do with add event listener argument 2 is not an object. Argument 2 needs to be an object. You remember functions are objects. So this function, you always learn from errors, it's supposed to be an object. That's what this console is. So it means we are outputting it as a string, which is the case here. So we just simply need to get rid of that string quotation. Then it simply needs to be that way. If we now enlarge this and minimize that and click on the button, it's fetching the data and it's outputting the data, but still there is a problem in the way we are outputting the data again here. So we look at our function here. This, I guess we can use inner HTML, and once we use that method inner HTML, that resolves, because we are not supposed to pass text content method to pass HTML tags. So that was just a simple error. So ideally, that's how you use async await. And I hope this covers everything that you need to learn about async await. And it should not be as complicated as it sounds. If you found this useful or you learned something new, kindly consider giving this video a thumbs up. I'm also requesting you to kindly click on subscribe button to support us. Thank you. I hope by now you understand the concept of async await. If you found value in this video, kindly consider giving it a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe. Thank you.